You're listening to Passions and Prologues, a literary podcast where each week I'll interview an author about a thing they love and how it inspires their work. My name is Adam Sokol, and if you've been listening since the beginning, welcome back. If this is your first time listening in, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Today's episode is with a fabulous author named Emily Austin, who wrote a book called Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead. And it is a book that I adore. I have adored it since the moment it came out. When it first came out, I interviewed her about it, and it might just be the book that I have recommended the most over the past couple of years. She has a new book that was recently announced that we talk about in the show. It was just kind of going through edits, so I don't want to talk about it here because it'll change a little bit before the actual book comes out, but we do talk about it in the episode, and she describes what it's about. So her first book is a really interesting look at mental health and the concept of religious trauma and a whole bunch of different things. And that is actually what we touch on today in this episode. It's a little bit different. Every other episode is something people are passionate about. I wouldn't exactly call religious trauma something Emily is passionate about, but it's something she has a great deal of experience with. And she grew up in a uniquely blended household where there was differing religious beliefs, and it didn't always create the most positive experience for her. I was very fortunate. I grew up in a household that also had differing religious beliefs, but it was a very positive experience for me. So we talk about both our experiences, and it's a really deep and interesting conversation. And I think you'll like that it's, again, if you've listened in for a while, the tone of this episode is going to be slightly different, but I really do think you'll enjoy it. As you may know, if you've been listening in, I've been letting people know, if you email any rating or review that you leave with the podcast, whether it's on Apple or Spotify or iHeartRadio, wherever you listen to the podcast, if you email me your review at passionsandprologues@gmail.com, I will give you some customized book recommendations. And I also want to share 2 book recommendations for you right now. One, a book that I just finished, and another book that has a little bit to do with mental health and things that we talk about in this episode. So the book that I just finished reading is a relatively new novel, came out this year, called All Dressed Up by Jilly Gagnon, I want to say. I'll put the link in the show notes. But All Dressed Up is a murder mystery wrapped in a murder mystery at a murder mystery. It's so great. The main protagonist and her boyfriend, or rather, I believe husband, go to a murder mystery dinner, but rather, instead of just a dinner, it's actually an entire weekend. It's like a weekend getaway where they have to bring 1920s style clothes, and they have to take on a character, and they have to, kind of live that world for the weekend. And while they do so, they're attending a murder mystery. So they have to figure out, what went wrong and who's to blame. And the main character is actually surprised. She didn't know that's what was happening. So she gets a bit of a startle at the beginning of this isn't a spoiler. It happens almost instantly. But someone does end up actually getting murdered for real while they're at this murder mystery. And so they have to figure out what went wrong. And it's just really interesting. As longtime listeners of the podcast I've been on know, I'm a huge fan of Agatha Christie novels. And this is very much like an Agatha Christie novel wrapped up in an Agatha Christie novel. So that's All Dressed Up by Jilly Gagnon. And then the other book I want to talk about, it 'tis the season. So I want to focus on it. And it has to do with mental health, is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson is one of, if not the greatest horror novelist really of all time. We Have Always Lived in the Castle came out in the 1960s, and it's a mystery novel centered around the main character, Mary Cat Blackwood, who lives with her agoraphobic sister and her ailing uncle on this private estate in Vermont. 6 years before the events of the novel, the family went through this horrible tragedy, and it left the 3 survivors really isolated from the small village, and you don't really know what happened until the very end. And it is just unsettling and creepy and delightful, and one of the best stories ever written. There's also a really, really good adaptation that came out, I believe, on Netflix That is delightful. Highly recommend that. But yeah, We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. Phenomenal. Okay, that is all the housekeeping. That is all my recommendations. I hope you enjoy this discussion with Emily Austin, all about religious trauma and how it affects her writing on Passions and Prologues. All right, so I am super excited to be joined by Emily Austin, who it's been a couple years since we did an interview for the last podcast that I was on, but I remember and I still think about and tweet about all the time, Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead. It's just one of my favorite books ever, and I tell everyone in the world about it. And so for anyone who has listened to episodes of this podcast, you'll know that calling it Passions and Prologues because we're talking about things that people are crazy passionate about, but this is going to be slightly different. To say that you'd be passionate about the thing we're going to be talking about might be a little strange, but it's definitely something that inspires your work. So, Emily, what are we going to be discussing today?
We're going to be talking about religious trauma today. So, yeah, not exactly. I think when you first asked, you were like, oh, what's something that, what was it, like something that you love? I was like,
yeah.
I don't want to say I love this, but
yeah, it's something where most people who come on are talking about, like, you know, whether it's weightlifting or the Muppets or whatever. But when you said that, I mean, having read your first book, like it makes a lot of sense to me. But what we can do is we can sort of start at the beginning. Like, what was your religious background when you were a child, and kind of how did I guess we'll get to the traumatic aspects of it, but what was your kind of religious upbringing?
Yeah, so I was in a Catholic family, but I have sort of an interesting situation because my mom was raised in a more like fundamentalist Protestant family, and my dad's side of the family was Catholic. So on a really like zoomed in level, I had an understanding of the rift between Protestants and Catholics just within my own family. But yeah, I was like baptized Catholic, and I went to Catholic school my whole life. But I did have my mom's side of the family I did have a pretty good window into like fundamentalist Christianity as well. So I got to sort of see the those two types of religions and how they have an impact on. I was particularly interested in the impact on queer people and on women.
I feel like I had a similar but like opposite end of the spectrum situation where I was raised Roman Catholic. My mom is Catholic. My father's side of our family is Jewish, but he's not practicing. So like we went to church and we went to Catholic school, but it was the opposite where like the other half of the family wasn't strictly anything. In fact, like we would go to Hanukkah and it would be more so like a stand-up comedy hour where like my aunts and uncles are always making. Yeah. So, what was that kind of experience like for you as a kid? Like, did you notice like rifts or differences between the family when you were younger, or was it more so just kind of you were going with the flow?
There were rifts between the family. So before my parents got married, like my mom's parents are both really like loving, nice people. And not to say that anyone else in the family isn't, but when they were first getting married, someone on that side of the family wrote a letter to my dad, saying that they didn't want them to get married because he was Catholic. And I knew that when I was a kid. And so that was always sort of, and I knew like my Oma and Opa on my mom's side would come to like our first communions and things, even though they weren't Catholic. And even though I knew there was like, they not only weren't Catholic, but didn't agree with Catholic. So I knew when they came to that, it was like a gesture. So that was always sort of, and I knew like when I was little, I knew when we were talking about certain topics with certain family members that there was like tension there. I think I was sort of indoctrinated in thinking, because I was raised Catholic and I was in Catholic school. And when I was a kid, I believed I was Catholic. And I thought of Catholic people as being right.
Yeah.
So I also already had this dynamic when I was interacting with that side of the family that even though I thought really highly of them and, loved them, I did think they were wrong religiously.
Yeah.
Like, I was a kid. So like, and I remember, and, to be fair, like, like obviously the Catholic side was wrong about some things too, but that side of the family like didn't believe in evolution, right? So
Mm-hmm.
there was like a level of of me being like a kid interacting with them and kind of thinking like they don't know things, which is not a great dynamic for a kid
Mm-hmm.
with, but
Yeah, so I know in like a slightly similar situation, I know my parents, when they got married, I know at least one set of grandparents both didn't approve and didn't attend their wedding. I don't remember if it was both, obviously before my time. But I remember like learning about that later on in life and being like secondarily angry about it. I was like, how dare you not, like looking at how
yeah,
wonderful a relationship my parents have. But I, like I said, it was less, I feel like, I don't know, traumatic is the wrong word for me. It was more like just less chaotic or stressful just because for us, it was like my dad had no interest in religion. Like he
yeah,
famously in our family anyway, got kicked out of several Hebrew schools just like by purposely acting out. So he didn't have to attend. So he never had any interest in it, but we would go to things to kind of support the family. Um, I'm interested from your family's like the dichotomy and the situation, like how did the side of the family that was like had like didn't believe in evolution and things like that, how did they approach your family when you would like those topics would come up?
so like for a lot, like the people who I interacted most with on that side of the family were really like they weren't super toxic, right? And they
Mm-hmm.
were like my mom's parents are Dutch immigrants. They came to Canada right after World War II, and like they were kids in Holland during World War II,
Mm-hmm.
and they're part of like a Dutch Reformed religion, which
Mm-hmm.
is so it I I knew from them that like that was culturally important to them. And so anyway, so I always thought highly of them. I just thought they didn't have the same knowledge, which is honestly layered because when I was a kid, I thought, oh, they don't know as much as Catholics know. And now I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
well, no. Like I think I was, there was layers of me being sort of wrong about how I saw other people in terms of religion. And that's one thing that I am interested in too, and is like there's sort of like an us versus them mentality
Mm-hmm.
that's very layered in some religious communities, but particularly in like fundamentalist or patriarchal
Mm-hmm.
religions. So like yeah, like evangelical religions or Catholicism to an extent, but Catholicism to my mom's side of the family, Catholicism was really liberal, right? And that also affected my perception because I was thinking like I'm in a liberal religion, but I wasn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I, so that's really interesting. When, like, at what point in your life did you realize that maybe this was a little bit out of the ordinary? Because, like I said, for me, it was like we had positively joked about it. Like we called ourselves cashews, like Catholic Jews. Like it was like our family kind of embraced the
Right.
like towing that line of like, yeah, we're Catholic, but we go to Passover and like I know what Yom Kippur is and all these different things. Like I had a good experience of seeing two different religions, and I think in a weird way, the fact that even though we went to Catholic school and my mom raised us Catholic, and like we never took it too seriously, so I think that ended up being a good thing, which is such a weird thing to say about religion and like spirituality, of being like we didn't take spirituality too seriously, so I'm okay about it now. But like, was there a point when you were younger that you started to realize like this riff is a real thing?
Yeah. So I think like well one thing I want to say is I don't think religion is like I think religion can be really important to people spiritually. I
Mm-hmm.
think it can be like important for your identity and it's good, but when it starts to be traumatic is when it's like when it starts telling you something is wrong with you or
Mm-hmm.
there's something you need to fix about yourself. Like and that's when it starts to become like religious abuse, right? And um, so when I was a kid, I think it wasn't until like when I was in like grade 7, I was from like a small town and I went to Catholic school, and I didn't like, I thought until I was probably like 12 or 13 that people didn't have sex until they were married.
Right.
I thought like, this is the way the world is. This is how it works. And then when I was in high school, and I also thought things like, I was like, oh yeah, being gay is a sin. Like that's a sin. I thought abortion was bad. Like I remember, and I thought that in high school too, because I went to Catholic high school, and we had like speakers come to assemblies who told us abortion was murder, and who told us, like, we had one who was like sort of a traumatic speaker, who said she was the product of rape, and that if her mom had gotten an abortion, and it was like, you're like 14 years old and you're like, oh my God, like that's horrible. And we were assigned like essays in school about why abortion is murder. Like it wasn't like write an essay about the topic of abortion. It was like the assignment is prove abortion is murder, which is really, psychologically, like, because it makes you think really hard about why it is and try to prove it. Like if you're a student who's really trying to write a good essay, which I was, I would have really tried to be like, well, I really want to prove this point. Right. And that's like, once I was in high school and I started to realize, some of the things that I've been taught weren't true about the world. Like, okay, like I realized like some of my friends are having sex, and I was like, I don't think they're going to hell. Like, Susie and Jimmy love each other. I don't care that they're having, and even if they didn't, like it didn't. And like my best friend growing up is gay. And I realized he was gay before myself. And I was like, well, obviously he's a good person. And I don't think like if he's going to hell, then what the hell is heaven? Like it sounds like God's a bad guy, right? Like why would I, you start to, and I think that's part of why, like, when I was a kid, I was made to think like, okay, like Catholics believe in evolution, for example, or not all of them, but generally Catholics believe in evolution. And so I kind of and I thought of them as more liberal because of my upbringing, right? I thought like, okay, Catholics are more liberal. And I thought like intellectually, I thought Catholics aren't just mindlessly believing, like they don't read the Bible literally, they read it metaphorically. They believe in evolution. So I thought, like, okay, this is the one where they've really thought it through. Like philosophically, it makes sense, but it made me think more philosophically about everything. And I started to be like, well, wait, like this doesn't make sense. Like, and I started to get really interested in like how the Bible was written. And actually, when I went to university, I got my major in English, but I took religious studies as almost every elective, and it was my like minor when I graduated. Because I was interested in it. And so I was like learning about like how was the Bible written, for example? What was the time period? What are and I was particularly interested in the translation for the words gay in the Bible, right? Like I wanted to know, okay, what did that mean originally? And I had like professors who, were very, like I took religious studies classes. So I had some professors who were doctors and rabbis, and some professors who, they were from different religions, and some of them could speak couldn't speak because I know it's ancient, but they understood the translations very well. And I was able to learn like, oh, okay, like I don't believe anymore that the original text said anything about being gay. And that sort of took me down a train of being like, this isn't right. I don't think they have it right. Or at least I don't think they have it right when they say something is wrong with someone, or that things like being gay or having an abortion or being a woman or being a woman who wants to speak or teach, or like those are the things that I think it's no longer about the religion, and it's more about like exerting power over people, and about people trying to use religion as a tool to, for white men to oppress other people. That's
I have so many agreeing thoughts that I want to like share. You're absolutely right. Like I'm similar in the sense that I've always been interested by kind of the history of religion. Like there's a book that I've read like 5 times since it's not new at all. It's very old. I think it's called The Case for Christ. And it's written by a person who I believe they're agnostic, but basically they wanted to go back in history and see if they could historically prove that like
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Jesus existed the human, not this deity.
Yeah.
And so it was really interesting, and it talks about a lot of the things that you were discussing, and like the thing that you hit that you said that I think is where I fall on my issues with religion is the fact that it is just about, it's like, how much power can I, a straight white male, exert over the rest of like the world? And when you look at all the different things that they pick and choose, like you said, like, oh, well, abortion is bad. And it's like, well, actually, that's nowhere in the Bible. There's this really awesome Instagram account, and I'll link it in the show notes. The name of the account is Jegaysus. He's this gay person who he has very long curly hair and a beard, and like he dresses like a gay Jesus. And he has a like educational background in biblical studies. Like this person knows everything there is to know on what the, like you said, the translations actually mean. And the fact that it's like, okay, well, if you really think somewhere in the Bible says like a man shouldn't lay with another man, and you want to take that literally, well, then I hope you're not wearing clothes that have, two different types of,
Nice verse, yeah.
Yeah. Or like my issue has always been like, if there is an omnipresent thing out there, first off, it's not gendered. So stop saying he. Like I hate when people do that. And also the fact that like, why would that omnipresent thing care about if I'm eating an animal that has a cloven hoof? Or like,
exactly, yeah.
Does that unspoken deity really care about the fact that I only eat fish on Fridays? Like, well, no, it's because the church owned fish markets. Like there's reasons. Yeah, exactly.
Interesting, like a level to that too, which is the problem with teaching kids. Well, not the problem. This is if you teach kids to be philosophical about religion and you make them like overthink things. Like Christianity is built on the idea that God sacrificed his body for us. But it's also built on the idea that your spirit matters more than your body. Mm-hmm. So if it's true that God is this sexist, homophobic guy, and those of us who are saying, oh, thanks, then we're sacrificing our spirits, which is, not to be super sacrilegious, arguably more of a sacrifice than the one made that is the foundation of the religion. So, yeah, I think like ultimately there's no way, it wouldn't make any sense for someone, for God to care if people are gay, and also like the Bible has passages about abortion. Like there is abortion in the Bible. But anyways, if that's really what the God cares about, mm-hmm. then they don't sound great. Like, why would I want to go there?
Yeah, there's, not to like make light of things, but I think one of the people who has like eloquently spoke on this succinctly, there's a comedian, Bo Burnham, who's just like a genius, and he has a song called God's Perspective, and it's just like, it's literally like the lyrics are like, why do you think I would care about any of these things? Like, it's just, I don't know, it makes, so at what point did you realize like, I think I want to start writing through these things? Or like, how did you begin to process it? Ironically, I have a therapy appointment right after this, which I'll probably be talking about these types of things. It was like perfect timing to do this. But like, how did you start to process all the things that were from your life that you disagreed with, and how did you approach that?
Yeah, so I think like in everyone in this room will someday be dead. I don't think that I don't think that reads too heavily critical of the Catholic Church to be. I think there's a couple little nods to it, but not like, I wouldn't say that that's fully what that's about. And I was given a grant by the Canada Council of the Arts to write poetry that reworks Bible passages and Catholic prayers to turn them into like pride sort of. So like, it's just like tweaking the language. So like the passage about like not lying with a man as you would with a woman is like changed to say like lying with a man as you would with a woman, you'll inherit heaven. Like love is proud, that kind of thing, like just changing the language. So I think like I'm definitely liable to write something that is more like directly in response to this, but I don't know that everyone in this room will someday. I think everyone in this room will someday be dead does focus a little bit on how it doesn't make sense for people to want to make other people's lives miserable, or to, make anyone live a certain way, so that for like a religious reason, when it would make their lives miserable. Like one thing that Gilda says is like Gilda's already so the character in the book is very depressed, and and it's not, it has nothing to do with coming out or anything, nothing directly related to being gay. If anything, her being gay is the only thing, and her relationship with a girl is the only thing that she's not depressed about. And she says something in the book along the lines of like, this religion would take away the only thing that makes my life worth living. And that's the one sort of sentiment that I did want to represent in that book, which is that, and I did that with her brother too, is that if, like, why would you want to take away like something that gives people fulfillment and makes them happy and makes them feel like their life is worth living, which for a lot of people is their relationships with other people. And, like if you were to tell someone, okay, so now, like, and that's one thing that the Catholic Church does too, which is manipulative, which is that they'll say, oh, you can be gay. Like, it's not the same as some evangelical religions who would say being gay doesn't exist. And it's just like a weird choice you've made. The Catholic Church would say you can be gay, but you have to be celibate. You can never get married. You can never have a relationship. And it's like, well, so you're taking away something that most people would say, well, not most, but probably most people would say when they're dying, like that was the most fulfilling part of their life. Or that was the most important part of their life, was their relationships with other people, like their spouse, or, that mattered to them. So that is one thing I was trying to get across in that book, is that when you use religion on people who potentially already, like if you're already depressed, like that's why I think that's a big part of why there are higher suicide rates among queer people. It is partly because of like homophobia and transphobia and that, but I think which this is, but it's also that you're taking away something potentially that makes people feel like their lives are worth living. So
yeah, it's a situation where, when you're younger and you're raised in a church of any kind, whether it's, like to one extreme where you're going every day and it's, like it's that fundamental, like this is the entire, like this is what we circle our lives around. Or like I said, where for me, we went to church every Sunday, but it wasn't like, we said grace before dinner, but it was like, God, thank you for this delicious food. Amen. Like literally that was our grace. Like regardless of how you are connected to religion, you are raised being like, okay, you should be able to trust and feel safe with your family, and you should be able to trust and feel safe in that religion, whether it's at a church or at a gathering, whatever it is. So like you said, it's easy to see how people can be emotionally affected heavily by religion when they're told, as they're discovering things about themselves for the first time, they're then told, you're no longer welcome in this place that you've been told for all your life you should feel safe in, if that makes sense.
Exactly. And that's why I'm interested in religious trauma specifically, because all forms of abuse are obviously horrible, but spiritual abuse is like a unique, like you're going to the core of someone and you're saying you're flawed and something's wrong with you. Like it's I don't want to say that's a worse kind of abuse than other kinds of abuse, but it's like, it's really terrible. Like it's a really horrible thing to do to someone, to say, at your core, you're bad. Like, and that's one of the, like the concept of original sin, for example, like that's toxic. That's not a nice way for people to exist, like to just feel. And that's why there's like the concept of like Catholic guilt, for example, like for people to exist in their whole existence and always feel like sort of ashamed of themselves. Is like, why are we, and the reason why I think is because you're more, you're easier to manipulate and to use for other people's gain. If you're constantly made to feel like something's wrong with you, you should feel bad about yourself. There's, there's no, there's no good reason for that. And that's when religion goes wrong. I think like there are, like we said, like there's lots of good, like religion can be good. Religion, for some people, it's really fulfilling and good, but it's when it starts to tell you something's wrong with you, or, like you're something that needs to be fixed, then that's when it starts to like spiritually abuse you.
We'll be back with more Passions and Prologues after this break.
Hi there, I'm Heather Drago.
And I'm Sarah Saunders.
We host the podcast, That's a Hard No, about saying no and setting boundaries.
So you can become that true and empowered you that this world needs. Saying no isn't just okay.
It's the key to living an authentic, fulfilling life.
I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor, so while this podcast is in no way a replacement for one-on-one therapy, I suppose I know what I'm talking about.
I'd say so. We talk about learning to say no and set healthy boundaries and how it impacts mental health, physical health, relationships, parenthood, and more.
Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and visit our website, hardnopodcast.com.
We're here to help you find your no and say it unapologetically.
That's a hard no.
And now, back to Passions and Prologues.
So what's your relationship now with like spirituality and religion? Because like, for me, even though I don't go to church, if ever anymore, really, I can't remember the last time I went to a mass, but I do find like comfort and solitude in a large cathedral, one of those places, just because it's like it's familiar and it's nostalgic and these different things. And I think because even now in my mid 30s, I'm still like terrified of death, and I want to feel like, I matter. I'm not just some random chance in my mind. Like, even though I don't believe in 99% of the stuff that like the church says, in my mind, I'm like, well, but there should be something out there, right? Because I have to matter, which is an absurd statement just because I'm still like grasping my own mortality. Like, what is your relationship with spirituality now?
Yeah, so I'm similar to you where I have like, I was raised Catholic. I have nostalgia for, like we always used to go to midnight mass, and like that reminds me of like in the same way that you might feel nostalgic for like a holiday movie, right? Like it's, and my grandma was really Catholic and she was great, and she's passed away. And so I think of like when I smell like that incense of like the Catholic church, I think of her. And I went, like most of my, not most, but a large number of my childhood memories are like my school was right next to the Catholic church, and we went there all the time. So like I think of myself like playing with my friends. Like I met my two best friends in Catholic choir. And yeah, so I have I do have a lot of positive associations with it. But I don't go to I wouldn't consider myself Catholic now. I would go for like a wedding or a funeral. I don't, I'm the same as you though, where I'm like, and I think I intellectualize it a little too much, because sometimes I think, okay, I don't believe anything happens when you die. But then I think, well, maybe I should believe it, because then if someone dies, like I think about like if a friend's parent dies and they know I don't believe in God or I don't believe anything happens, how am I going to comfort them? So maybe it would be better functionally for me to just keep up the facade. But I don't know. I think I'm agnostic. I swing back and forth. I do sometimes I don't know if this is sometimes I pray, but I don't know if I'm really praying or if I'm just sort of I will think I hope, I want to put the energy out in the world that I hope something good happens to someone, or that someone who's sick feels better, or that when I know someone's dying, it's not terrible. But I don't know if that's actually me trying to actually pray, or if I'm just thinking.
Yeah. And I waffle back and forth between being terrified of just one day not waking up, and also there's this author Drew McGarry who writes for this website Defector, and he's written a number of novels, but he also wrote a memoir called The Night the Lights Went Out, and he had a brain hemorrhage at a bar with his friends after a work event, and he wasn't drunk or anything. He just they to this day don't know what happened. And he basically should have died, and he didn't. And he woke up like 3 weeks later in the hospital. And then it's like the book is about like how he slowly recovered. But he like I interviewed him for it, and he basically said, I was like, well, how like terrifying is that thought of just not waking up? And he's like, well, for those 3 weeks, I just didn't experience anything. He's like, there's nothing to be scared about because it was just nothing. And so like I waffle back and forth between like, that sounds peaceful, and also being like, but no, then I just won't be here. What like
Yeah, it's scary to think. I do think that though, like that is something I think like is like everything does end. Like a book, for example, if you think of life as a book,
mm-hmm.
I don't want a book to go on forever and ever. I want it to be like I would prefer to have a nice life with a nice ending
Mm-hmm.
than something that goes on forever and doesn't,
Yeah.
So, but it is kind of scary to imagine that.
Yeah. I mean, it's clearly something you've thought about since your first book is literally titled "Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead." So what made you want, because we'll get to your upcoming book in a little bit, because I know that there was a Publishers Marketplace announcement about that recently, but what made you decide to write about these different things for your first novel? Like, when did you say like, okay, I want to spend a lot of time really diving into this from a fictional standpoint?
Yeah, I think I started writing that book right after my grandma died. And my grandma was this very Catholic person. And she was also like very kind of like wise about death. And like her death was like, it was really devastating for her to die because she was such a, like she was a presence. But it was also like she died nicely. Like it was like she had leukemia, which is like, I don't know if this is always the case, but she was like an old lady, and she called it old lady cancer. And we knew she was like, she had it for a long time. It's the kind of thing that lasts for a long time. And it wasn't like she was sick for a long time. It was just like, oh, I sort of know that I'm not going to live forever because I have leukemia. And she never got uncomfortable. And when she was in the hospital, she was like, she ate like an entire tray of apple crisp the day before she died. And it was like, it wasn't but it was still like obviously devastating for her. She was like if I went into my house, it was just as likely for her to have been there as my parents.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go to their house and just open the door, and they didn't live that far away. And so it was like close family sort of relationship.
Mm-hmm.
But when she died, I was at the funeral, and we were in the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church is the one I grew up in my whole life. And so I was sort of standing there like, okay, like my very Catholic grandma is passed away, and here I am in a Catholic church. And I was, sort of in a depressive state, like even regardless of that, because it was sort of that awkward, mid-20s-ish, I guess, age where you start to be like, well, wait a minute, So that's when I started writing it. And I was sort of thinking, I wrote before, but I never really was able to write, with some exceptions, like a full story. Like it was always like just sort of acting on the compulsion to write.
Yeah.
And with this one, I was like, okay, I should probably at least a little bit think of how this could actually be a book. And I thought, what would be the easiest way for me to do that? And then I thought, I should pick from things that aren't difficult for me to write about. I have a day job and other things going on. So I was like, okay, I can write about Catholicism. Easy. A lesbian in a Catholic church, no problem. Someone who has extreme anxiety, I'll just pick some of these bits out of my diary and we'll be all done. Mm-hmm. Not really though, because a lot of people will like talk to you and I don't know if you've like, sometimes people will be like, will talk to me as if I'm Gilda. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, no, I'm not, like, it's like, and obviously there are bits, but like, for example, I've had people message me on Instagram, like Gilda's Instagram. She says something in the book that's like, oh, I just have one picture on Instagram, and it's like of a cat I saw once. I've gotten more than one message that are like, I thought your Instagram was just a cat, like one picture of a cat. And I'm like, you didn't read a memoir.
Yeah.
That's not, yeah.
Yeah. So only a few people know about my book so far, but my main character is like an old tailor in his 80s, so I don't think I'm gonna have to.
It's you, yeah. I guess I went a little too close to.
Well, I abandoned a manuscript after like 70,000 words, and it was basically like a retell. It might as well have been a memoir about my high school, which closed after my senior year, and like reading through it, it's so obvious. Like, no, this is just a heightened version of me and a heightened version of all these people, and I was like, I don't want to cross my fingers, get that published one day, and then have all my like classmates that I went to school with. Like, hell, man, like.
You know what though? Like I used to be more worried about like, oh, like I don't want to, like I'd overthink certain things I wrote to be like that one line, that one guy I knew 5 years ago. People don't read your book. They're not going to read your book. Like it's going to be like a small handful of people. Mm-hmm. Most of them aren't. So my philosophy is I don't like if there's something you can read between the lines, the odds of you getting there are pretty slim. So yeah, don't worry about it.
So talk to me about your new book, Interesting Facts About Space. I'm curious if there's any kind of through line, or if you were just like, okay, I have written about emotional and religious and spiritual trauma and my like mental health aspects. I'm going to step way off into left field. Like, how's it look?
This one is still, so this one, it does move away from religious trauma. There isn't, I don't think there's very much religious trauma addressed in that book, but it is still about mental health. So the main character in that story has like an irrational fear of bald men. And like a phobia is just anxiety, right? Mm-hmm. So she's also, similarly to Gilda, she's very anxious, but and the story's about her, feeling like someone's following her. So we haven't even started editing it yet. So I don't have a very good, summary of what the story is, but that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I totally, the only reason I asked you about it is because I know that there was the Publishers Marketplace announcement, so I knew it was like out in the world. But I will say, and I think I might have told you this when we were talking about your first book, like one of the things that I felt like I related so much to it was because of the way that you wrote it, and it's written like a person who has anxiety, and it's written like, and I know I'm not unique in this, obviously, because you wrote the book, like it's written like the way my brain works, where it'll be like a sentence here and then a sentence there, and then I'll be like, shit, I need to go back to that first thing I was thinking of. And even though I had somebody else who doesn't suffer from anxiety like I do tell me like, wow, reading this made me anxious. But as an anxious person, reading it brought me peace. So are you thinking about crafting the second book kind of like a similar vein? I've just never, this is just like a roundabout way to compliment you. Like I've never read anything that so accurately depicted how my brain works.
That means a lot to me. Thank you. Yeah, I know sometimes people like, sometimes I'll see a review that's like, oh, this book made me miserable. Like I hate it. And then other people will be like, oh, this book was fun. Like some people will be like, why do people say this is funny? This isn't funny. This is so sad. And I'm like, I can tell who has mental illness when I, you know what I mean? But yeah, I do think so I did lean into that, and everyone in this room will someday be dead, because I was trying to create the idea that she's having a panic attack, or her thoughts are racing. But I also have anxiety, and that's how I would write. That is sort of my writing style. Mm-hmm. I think it's a little less in this one because she's anxious in a different way than Gilda is. She has a phobia, and she has a fear, and so that's more of the. But it is still sort of jumpy because she is anxious too, and because I'm anxious, and that's how I think. So
yeah. Is there, so I'm asking a lot of people who I'm talking to, what their why is for writing this book. I think for the first one, it's kind of obvious after, the last 30 minutes of us talking and having spoken before, but what was sort of your why for the second book? What made you want to say okay, I'm going to spend, whether it's 4 months or 6 months or however long it takes you to draft that, what was the reason that you're this is the topic I want to write about?
I guess, when I first started thinking of it, I was like, okay, I still feel like I have more to write about in terms of anxiety. Mm-hmm. But I wanted to, write a new story, obviously. And so I was thinking, okay, what are other sort of experiences I've had in terms of anxiety outside of existential dread type of anxiety, which is what Gilda has. And I was thinking fear, phobia. So I was trying to write about what it's like to be someone who's deeply fearful. Mm-hmm. And the main character in that book is and again, I'm not going to be able to speak to this very well, but she's fearful, she has a phobia of bald men, mm-hmm. but she also has a phobia of intimacy, and she has it parallels like her own sort of like other fears that are less plainly written on the page.
Mm-hmm.
So I was trying to write about feeling like her main thing is that she's worried she's a bad person, and she has this fear of intimacy, partly because she thinks she's a bad person. And then that's sort of like an attempt at sort of comically paralleled in being that in that she's afraid of baldness.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the.
I love it. This is a audio medium, so people won't see me having been like nodding my head. Yes, I just think the way that you write, so like it's exactly how my brain works. So like as you're describing it, I'm like, yeah, I want to. Yeah, I have those feelings where like once a day at minimum, I'm like, wow, I'm an awful person. It'll be for like the most irrational reason. Like my dog will be itchy and I'll be like, wow, I haven't even like thought about getting him medicine. It's like, what are you talking about? Yeah. So those are irrational things. Yeah.
That's sort of an extension of part of what we were talking about, like that idea that you're raised to feel like something's wrong with you. There's something you need to fix. You're fundamentally at your core bad is sort of reflected in that book, even though it's not directly tied to Catholicism.
Yeah, I think I do think the reason we all start questioning those things when we get to be like either teenagers or in our 20s is like I feel like it took me that long to kind of understand like, oh, my parents don't know literally everything. Like they're also just trying to figure life out, and they're not omniscient. Like they don't have all the answers. They were just trying to figure this out too. And they thought this was maybe the best thing for us. And
exactly. Yeah. I think like I sort of have a theory that's like optimistically, that's why a lot of religions come to exist. It's for like someone, way back when thought if we give people like more black and white rules about behavior, then they'll have this handbook to be good. Yeah. But then what happens is it falls into the hands of people who want to use it for other reasons. And then it ultimately does the opposite. But yeah.
And then you're left with exactly what's going on in the United States currently.
Exactly.
But that's a whole nother podcast. I am leaving every conversation with authors by asking for a recommendation. It can be a book. And in fact, most people have done books, but it could be a TV show you're enjoying or a new album that you're really liking. Whatever a thing is that you're just enjoying lately, like what's something Emily Austin would recommend?
I just read a book called Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. It's a book about a two-spirited Indigenous person in Canada, and it's about like sex work and trauma. And it was really like it's sort of more of a like here's a look at a person type of story than it is like this is a story about someone on a quest type of thing. But I really loved it. It had like a really like sharp voice, gives a really interesting insight to like that particular type of identity, being two-spirited and like living on the res and so it's Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead, really good.
I will add, have you read All My Puny Sorrows by Miriam?
I love that book. That's one of my favorite books. That was my favorite book when I was a teenager. That was the first book that I read that wasn't like like what's assigned to you in school, that I was like, oh my God, books can be so good.
Yeah. I will is it Miriam? Is it Toes? I don't know how to pronounce her last name.
Yeah, good question. I don't think I've ever had to say it out loud.
Toews, and like everything else for everybody. I'll put the link in the show notes. But I will say, like, if you like Emily's first book, I feel like All My Puny Sorrows.
Oh, that's such a nice compliment.
Would be like a connection. Yeah, no, that's one that kind of stuck with me when it comes to like religion and conservative families and things like that.
And actually another, Casey Plett is a Canadian writer, and she was also in like similarly like in a Mennonite family. She's a trans woman though, and she writes stories about like, she wrote Little Fish is one, and she wrote a short story collection recently, A Dream of a Woman. And anyway, I think if you like Miriam, however you say her last name, you like Casey Plett.
Oh, that's amazing. Well, Emily, I much like all of the first 8 people I've talked to, I literally just sent you a DM on Twitter and was like, hey, I really loved talking with you the times we've gotten to. Would you mind doing this? And you were so gracious to say yes. So I really appreciate it. Thank you for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me. It's always nice chatting with you. Anytime if you ever have a blank spot and you need someone to fill it, let me know.
Passions and Prologues is proud to be an evergreen podcast and was created by Adam Sokol. It was produced by Adam Sokol and Sean Rule Hoffman. And if you are interested in this podcast and any other evergreen podcast, you can go to evergreenpodcast.com to discover all the different stories we have to tell.